A freighter carrying a crew of 29 disappeared on Lake Superior during a severe storm last night, and so far, no survivors have been found. The freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was transporting iron ore when it ran into high winds and 25-foot waves.
It's been 50 years since he passed, but Pam Johnson,
this is one of my favorite pictures, and he's smiling,
remembers her dad well.
My name is Pamela Johnson, and I'm daughter of the old cook, Robert Rafferty.
Her father was a cook on the Edmund Fitzgerald the night it sank into Lake Superior, killing all 29 men on board.
It was so hard. He loved me so much. I was his only girl.
The Great Lakes freighter, memorialized in a song by Gordon Lightfoot, traces its roots back to when it first touched water in 1958. But its story goes back even further, decades further, to another ship named the Fitzgerald.
On November 14th of 1883, the first Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, and this was off Long Point. It was a schooner that was built by Edmund Fitzgerald, the uncle of the one that we know so famously lost the ship in 1975. All 6 crew members were lost. It was a tragedy that the Long Point lifesavers came out. All they found was an upside-down lifeboat crushed on the surface.
Rick Mixter has spent much of his life fascinated by the Great Lakes, the ships that sailed them, and the stories of those who didn't make it home. He is the author of Tattletale Sounds, the Edmund Fitzgerald Investigations, as well as a member of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. Their museum is located in Whitefish Point, just a dozen or so miles from where the Edmund Fitzgerald and its crew have been buried beneath the water since 1975. Mixter says back in the 1950s, Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was looking to build a ship as a business enterprise. But they didn't want to make just any ship. Northwestern's would be the largest Great Lakes bulk carrier on fresh water. As to how it got its name, Mixter says it was supposed to be named for the company.
As a matter of fact, the president of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, whose name is Edmund Fitzgerald, wanted it to be called Northwestern. And he actually came up with 3 or 4 other titles, but the board insisted that they name it for the president. And the story goes back to even Edmund Fitzgerald's daughter, who says as soon as he took a bathroom break, they voted and they put his name on the ship. And that was a big deal because this was going to be the largest object ever launched into fresh water.
The Fitzgerald was launched on June 8, 1958 at River Rouge, Michigan. Corey Adkins with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum says the Fitzgerald was famous long before her tragic end.
It was the fastest and biggest and longest ship on the Great Lakes. It was called the Queen of the Great Lakes. And she broke iron ore carrying records up and down the lakes.
729 feet long, it could carry 30,000 tons. Back in 75, when our cars were mostly metal, that would be 1,000 automobiles in one trip. That's pretty incredible. That's the average car dealership output in 1 year in one trip, and the Fitzgerald made over 730 of those trips.
The Fitzgerald transported taconite, a type of iron ore, which is a common commodity on Great Lakes freighters. Sarah Summers Ludke with the Lake Superior Maritime Museum says freighters pick up the ore in the Twin Ports and take it east to be turned into steel.
It's like a direct connection to the things that we use every day in our lives. So they're moving iron ore pellets that produce steel that we that we have in our cars and our appliances and things like that. So it's that, I think that connection to seeing how we use it in our everyday life to realize like, oh, it's important that they move these cargoes, and it's an efficient way to move them, and it's a good connection that we have here to the rest of the world.
For decades, the Edmund Fitzgerald did its job, moving iron ore across the Great Lakes, all while breaking records for how much cargo she could carry. And every year, the shipping season would wind down in November.
It's the stormiest month of the year.
Elmer Engman founded the annual Duluth event, Gales of November.
Well, weather forecast didn't look that bad. Back in '75, you had good weather forecasting, but nothing to really predict what happened in Lake Superior that day.
A nice, calm, beautiful fall day can turn into a stormy day within hours, maybe even minutes.
In 1975 alone, Fitzgerald went through 5 gales, 5 different gales, each one capable of doing more damage. And the cook who left the ship in September said that the engineers had told the captain there was more damage below. And McSorley said, hey, it just has to hold together for a few more months and I'm retiring.
On November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was loaded up for its last run of the season, led by Captain Ernest M. McSorley, who was planning to retire.
Captain Ernest McSorley was very famously first a shipyard guy. He knew about the hulls on ships. He worked his way up to captain. He became the biggest captain for the Ogilvy Norton fleet, which Columbia Transportation, their flagship was the Edmund Fitzgerald. Here's a boat that was built as the biggest that they had at the time. They had the best cook, they had the best captain, and really the best crew. It was an air-conditioned ship. Not all the ships at that time period were, so it was the ship that everybody wanted to get on board.
McSorley oversaw the loading of iron ore pellets, placed into the hatchways on top of the ship. On that Sunday, they sailed out of Superior, Wisconsin's harbor, on their way out east.
It left Superior, Wisconsin on November 9th. There was no indications of anything that was going to be wrong with the weather. But then as November 9th turned into November 10th, it quickly changed. That's when the storm started to show its teeth.
Heading into Lake Superior, the Edmund Fitzgerald was not alone. Another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, was sailing right behind her. Mixter says the captains were seasoned meteorologists, and they knew there was a storm coming, but they completely misjudged it.
When the Edmund Fitzgerald left Burlington Northern, they immediately had small craft warnings. That means smaller boats should be advised to stay off the water, fishing boats and the such. They knew all these captains are very seasoned meteorologists. Their lives depend on understanding the weather. But we didn't have the incredible technology we had. There was one satellite that was taking pictures of the Great Lakes at the time. There were no buoy systems that gave in real-time wave heights around the lakes. The ships would report in at 8 o'clock in the morning to the Weather Service, and they would put together the forecast, and they saw this big storm that was coming up from Oklahoma going into Marquette. And as the captains looked at it, they had been on the lakes many times, and they thought, it'll take this long for it to get to Marquette. It'll take this long for it to jump over to Marathon, Ontario, to go across Lake Superior. And the truth is, they misguessed it. It was much faster crossing Lake Superior. So as they went through and passed many ships that were actually hiding from the storm, including the Blau that was 800 feet long. So it's almost 80 feet longer than the Edmund Fitzgerald. They kept going all the way up, and as soon as they got to the big point at Otterhead, the lighthouse there, they made the turn to go down. They realized they were in the eye of the storm. They had misguessed, and so now the storm is starting to go north of them. The winds are going to change from the northeast to the northwest, and when they go from the northwest, now those waves are building from Thunder Bay all the way to Whitefish Point, 3 stories tall, 30 feet tall of waves. And if they just had another hour, they would have made it. But unfortunately, it crossed so much faster, and both the Anderson and the Fitzgerald got caught in the middle of it.
But rough weather was hardly anything new to the retiring captain. McSorley was famously known as a rough weather skipper, someone unafraid to go headfirst into storms, even as his own crew on more than one occasion feared they could sink. But all the while, as the Fitzgerald and the Anderson moved through the November storm, they were in communication with one another's status.
The Anderson was 10 miles behind the Fitzgerald that night. And as they were communicating, they were saying, hey, man, my fence rail's down. We're having some issues. But, if you could just plot my course, that'd be great because our radar's down too.
The Edmund Fitzgerald's radar was down, and it needed help from the Anderson to navigate where they were going. During some of those communications, McSorley told the Anderson that he had a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. In the nautical world, a list means the ship is taking on water and it's tilting to one side. But they only had a few more miles to go before they reached the safety of Whitefish Bay. The Anderson asked if the pumps were going, and McSorley said yes. At 7:10 p.m., the Anderson asks, quote, "How are you making out with your problems?" Captain McSorley replies, "We are holding our own."
And McSorley called back and he said, "We're holding our own." That means he probably was doing well.
We're holding our own. That's kind of a chilling proposition to think about. Maybe he thought the Fitzgerald could have limped to Whitefish Bay, which they were trying to get through. They were trying to get to Whitefish Bay because that's where our lighthouse is, and that's where a lot of ships go to hide behind Whitefish Point to hide from storms. So when he said that, he thought he could make it that 17 miles.
The crew of the Anderson reportedly saw giant waves and then a snow squall blinding their view of the Fitzgerald. Then, the Anderson could no longer see the Fitzgerald on radar. At 7:22 p.m., just 12 minutes after McSorley said they were holding their own, the Anderson called the Fitzgerald, but there was no answer. The weather cleared, and the Anderson's captain pulled out his binoculars. He could see the lights of other vessels that were on the lake, but not the Fitzgerald's. In a matter of moments, the ship and its crew were gone.
So in that blinding storm, Fitzgerald vanished. And as the Anderson finally makes it to the safety of Whitefish and gets below Parisian Island, they're safe, but they're calling the Coast Guard saying, "We believe that the 729-footer is gone with 29 lives, and you should be looking for them." And the Coast Guard at first didn't believe them.
After the Anderson reached the safety of Whitefish Bay, the Coast Guard called his captain back, asking if the Anderson would be willing to go back into the storm and search for the Fitzgerald. The Anderson's captain said, quote, "I'm afraid I'm going to take a hell of a beating out there," but then told the Coast Guard, "I'll give it a try."
Right away, they're already the furthest away from the shipwreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The three saltwater vessels are much closer. There's also several ships at Whitefish Point. So immediately they start calling around, asking for people to go out into the storm, and the saltwater vessels say, "We just can't turn around. We'll watch as we go through the storm, and we'll look for anything, but we're not turning around." So the Coast Guard calls the Roush, and the Roush says, "No, we'd be hazarding our ship. We are not going to go back in there." And before anybody passes blame on the Roush, that's the captain's priority. His ship, his crew, above all others. So he made the right call. The William Clay Ford said, "Well, we'll turn around," but it took them a little while to turn around. In fact, they met at the same time that the Anderson did, because right away the Anderson said, "What about those other vessels that are closer?" And the Coast Guard said, "You're the only one that'll go back." So they convinced him to turn around. He went back into the storm and was only making, I think he said, like 8 miles an hour going into that storm, trying to go up. And that's when he really received the heaviest part of the gale.
Did the Anderson see anything, find anything while they were out?
No, and the captain said it was really an exercise in futility, was what he said. And that was because even if he had seen a lifeboat full of people, he was worried that he could do nothing with his ship that was nearly 800 feet long. What's he going to do to try to stop that ship in a big storm to rescue those people? He believes he saw the cut-in-half lifeboat, saw a little bit of debris, but even with the help of the Coast Guard dropping flares down, he really couldn't see anything that night. So unfortunately, that search turned out that all 29 guys went down with the ship immediately. And if there's any mercy on the Great Lakes, it was over quickly for them. And they didn't suffer as so many sailors did by getting off the boat, going onto a lifeboat or a life raft, and then sadly perishing later.
But the first time she called and said that there was an accident and your dad has probably died. That was the last run that my dad was on. And when the boat sank, he was retiring. I always wonder if he was laying in his bed and the waves came upon him, or he covered himself up, or he was in the hallway trying to run down to get into the room. These are things I have. I want to say he's in the bed. That's my thought. But I am a proud daughter. I love my dad so much. I just hope he didn't hurt too long, or when he drowned, it went fast.
Johnson says she lived thousands of miles away at the time and was about 8 months pregnant with her last son, so she couldn't make it to the funeral. But today she has her memories and photos, her dad's cookbook, and a signed record from Gordon Lightfoot.
My mom had called and told me that there was a song that was written about your dad. And I said, well, what is it? And she says, well, it's a guy named Gordon Lightfoot. And I vaguely remembered that. So we're in Germany and we're at the CEO Club. And it happened to be, I believe, my birthday, January 15th. And all of a sudden they played that song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And I got really mad at first because I'd never heard it before. And they're dancing to it. But I calmed down after a bit and I fell in love with the song before it was over. And look at that, I happened to buy that album too. And then he wrote that for me.
What does it say?
It says, to Pam, love Gordon Lightfoot.
In his song, Gordon Lightfoot directly mentions Pam's father, Robert. When supper time came, Lightfoot sings, the old cook came down from the deck and said, fellas, it's too rough to feed ya. Later, Lightfoot sings, her dad says, fellas, it's been good to know ya.
But on the 25th anniversary, Gordon Lightfoot came to Salina, Kansas, which is real close to where I live, and he came for a concert. The newspaper here in town found out who I was and invited me up to their radio station to do an interview, and they asked me all kinds of questions. But at the very end, they said, well, would you like to hear the song? Of course, I would always like to hear that. When it got all done, he gave me 2 tickets. This is to the front row center seats of Gordon Lightfoot. And I was amazed that they did that for me, and I went backstage and he held my hand there and I looked at him and he said, I know. We just held hands for a little bit. So that was an experience for me to be so close to Gordon Lightfoot at that time and thanking him for the writing of the song.
In his song, Gordon Lightfoot sings about the hatchways caving in. It's one of the reasons some people think the ship might have sunk. But many experts believe the Fitzgerald went down because of a variety of factors, the most important of which was the storm itself. What we do know is that the ship broke in two. Mixter has scuba dived to see the ship for himself, and he believes it broke in two before it went down.
There's many paintings of the Edmund Fitzgerald in different sinking situations, the most popular being a nosedive to the bottom that she vanished without ever making a call for help. But the things that we found on the bottom have really ruled out that she went down in one piece. Most of the cargo I found was behind the stern part of the ship. That there's no way it would have spilled out that way. It had to have broken on the surface. I found hatches 2 and 3, which are on the bow section, at the stern section. So again, cracked on the surface, the covers blew out, and the bow section kept on going. And that's the only way that we could see that kind of playing out. So how did that happen? The simple answer is that it was a storm. There was a wave that was 30 feet high that sped past Cooper on the Anderson, hit the Fitzgerald, but she was wounded. She was leaning because of the water coming in. Her hatches were clearly leaking as well. And unfortunately, we believe there was also keel damage. That's why the Anderson didn't sink from this big wave, but the Fitzgerald did. Extra damage, more water, and the Fitzgerald never had a chance to even call for help.
But why the Fitzgerald went down and not other ships in the same storm? Atkins says we'll never know for sure.
You know, there's a lot of theories out there. Why did it sink? Nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever know why it sank. So, you know, we don't really subscribe to theories at the Shipwreck Museum because there's no reason to, because why? It's all subjective. It sank. It sank in a horrible storm. 29 people lost their lives. And a lot of families got hurt by this.
I think it's important for people to remember the crew that was on board. I also think it's important for people to know that even though this terrible tragedy happened, there have been a lot of improvements to make current mariners safer on the waters. And there's a lot learned from the shipwreck that go directly towards the safety of mariners today. One of the main things that we try to get across when we've got an educational program about the Fitzgerald that we do for school groups, and one of the main points is to get them to realize that there were no survivors, and so that leaves a hole in the story. Like what happened, we don't know We know the boat is broken in half, but we don't know if it happened on the top of the water or at the bottom of the water. We don't know what caused that vessel to break in half. So just, the mystery surrounding it is probably still going to be something that we're going to have to live with and come to our own conclusions.
At the Detroit Mariners Cathedral, the bell rings in memory of those lost in Great Lakes tragedies. The first time it was done for the Edmund Fitzgerald was by Reverend Ingalls the night of the shipwreck.
When he heard that the Fitzgerald went down that night, he went into the church and rang the bell 29 times. He did that immediately that night.
But it's a different bell, the Fitzgerald's bell, that people all over the world travel to see. It's located at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point, Michigan.
In July of 1995, 2 submarines lit up the Edmund Fitzgerald, and a newt suit, a guy in a submarine suit that looks like a robot, went down there and cut the structure that held the bell, and then they tied it off, and then they brought it up to the surface. And when it broke the surface, it gonged just on time for those family members that were there to hear it. So in many ways, some of us were like, boy, is this going to start a problem of taking things off the shipwrecks? We had heard about pellets being taken off the ship, and now we have the bell coming off. But it seems to have ended there. The Canadian government are protecting the ship, and perhaps it will stop there.
The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum is a place of solitude, memory, and discovery. A lot of people come up just to see the bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is great, and that's how we honor, the 29 men that went down on the Edmund Fitzgerald. We honor them with that exhibit, and everybody comes up to see that. But when they go into the museum and they see this beautiful Second Fresnel order lens, the lighthouse lens from White Shoal Light, it's huge. And then people start walking through the museum and finding out about all these other shipwrecks and all these other stories, and they're fascinated. It's a place that fascinates people, and then they end up walking out onto the beach and they think about what they just learned and saw.
When people visit the Lake Superior Maritime Museum in Duluth, Sarah Summers-Lukey stresses that the people who died aboard the Fitzgerald and other wrecks were just people doing their jobs.
The people that were out there were doing their jobs. That's their career, and it's a tough life living out there. And we've got people today that still do it, that still travel along the Great Lakes and load and unload cargo for us. It's a difficult life. People are away from their families and their homes for months on end.
Pam Johnson still has her favorite photo of her dad, his cookbook, and her memories. She plans to travel to Ohio and Michigan to talk about her dad, and she hopes the story reminds people to hold their loved ones close.
I'm going to be a speaker, and I just want to be able to tell people how important it is to love the ones. You never know when the next day they're going to be in the water. There were 29 men on there that were of other people. We wanted them. We wanted them to be alive.
It's been 50 years since the Edmund Fitzgerald sank. Sharing a moment of reflection, Minnesotans gather every year at Split Rock Lighthouse. The beacon shines a light into the lake, and light is shined on the memory of mariners lost in those waters.
Michael E. Armagost, 3rd mate. Frederick J. Beecher, porter. Thomas Benson, oiler. Edward E. Binden, first assistant engineer. Thomas D. Borgeson, AB maintenance man. Oliver J. Champos, 3rd assistant engineer. Nolan F. Church, porter. Ransom E. Cundy, watchman. Thomas E. Edwards, Second Assistant Engineer. Russell G. Haskell, Second Assistant Engineer. George J. Hall, Chief Engineer. Bruce L. Hudson, Deckhand. Alan G. Coleman, Wiper. Gordon F. McClellan, Wiper. Joseph W. Mazie, Special Maintenance Man. John H. McCarthy, First Mate. Captain Ernest M. McSorley, Master. Eugene W. O'Brien, Wheelsman. Carl A. Peckel, Watchman. John J. Povich, Wheelsman. James A. Pratt, Second Mate. Robert C. Rafferty, Steward. Paul M. Ripa, Deckhand. John D. Simmons, Wheelsman. William J. Spengler, Watchman. Carl A. Thomas, Deckhand. Ralph G. Walton, Oiler. David E. Wise, Cadet. Blaine H. Wilhelm, Oiler. And a final toll for all those sailors that were lost on the lakes.